the Forged and Unbroken podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast, and this is going to be part 3 on developing grit of the Safety is Scary series. And for the last 2, we started breaking down what is safety, what it means, historical perspectives, and where some of that safety culture is kind of developed, both good and bad. And then the second part was, what is risk aversion? What are behavioral reasons for risk aversion? What's the good and the bad and the ugly? How we can kind of lean into the fight. What are some of the psychological counterparts and theories and ideologies that are out there that are keeping us from leaning into risk, and others are kind of pulling back. So today is the last part on this, and I'm calling it developing grit. And this is kind of like the final culminating piece to hopefully counteract the last 2 pieces that we were talking about. I think when I talk to people who are ready to kind of go on a journey of like, hey, I've been letting myself down, letting the team down, or I just know that I'm capable of more, and they try to institute change, sometimes they take on too much, or maybe they're not happy with the progress. And these are things that take a long time, the training, the expertise, the workouts. These are things that have to develop over time. And I think that's actually one of the barriers to why people are not as capable as they are on the fireground and in life, is because it is a crazy commitment, right? And now I do want to start with a little bit of a story, and I want to send some special thanks out to my friends over in St. Louis, Chris Tobin and Jeff Weffelmeyer, who talked about this incident in an earlier podcast. We're going to remember firefighter Ben Polson, who died in the line of duty January 13th, 2022. Ben and his crews went in, knocked down fire on the first floor, started doing some fire suppression on the second floor, realized, hey, things are too advanced. The building is not stable. On their exit, the building collapsed and trapped Polson and one other firefighter, and Polson ultimately succumbed to his injuries. Now, I want to let a quick video snippet from the news of their Fire Chief Jankerson talk about this little piece. So here's Fire Chief Jankerson.
We look at that every day. We look at the buildings we go into. We provide all of our captains, all of our members get schooling, education, training on what to look for. And we get paid to protect lives. We get paid to take a risk. And, it's hard to tell somebody on the street who's yelling and screaming at us, that there might be somebody in there. Well, this risk might be too great, so we take the risk. And unfortunately and terribly, the risk we took today wasn't worth it. We lost a firefighter.
So Chief Jankerson says it well that, we encounter a lot of risk, and there are times when we lean into the fight and it's going to catch us. Now, the interesting part of this story is that they thought that this was an occupied dwelling. Well, it did have bars on the windows and nobody was inside at the time, and some signs would suggest that maybe it was a vacant. Like you said, they still have bars on the windows. And in St. Louis, if there are bars on the windows, most people rip them off and scrap them if nobody's living there. And there were still bars on the windows, he said earlier in the news report. So they had an idea that there may have been people in there from other people reporting. And so they leaned in and went into the firefight and unfortunately caught them. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in the same shift, with almost the exact same crews, same neighborhood, same style of construction, later that night, they ran another fire. And things married up really cleanly, a ton of similarities. And when they arrived on location, again, same crews who pulled out Ben Polson earlier, not pulled out, but were operating with him, they ended up saving multiple people that were trapped behind bars in a working fire. And I just find this juxtaposition so incredible that within one 24-hour shift, the same people, same neighborhood, similar construction style and fire dynamics, lose a firefighter, unfortunately, but then when they had every right to pull back, go off the floor, say, hey, we're not doing this, we're being too aggressive, they leaned into the fight and ended up saving a ton of people. And I think that's a mindset that we need to be aware of and carry potentially into our professions, that the whiplash is crazy going from a line of duty to rescuing people. But it's something that is absolutely possible, and St. Louis showed that. But they leaned into the fight and they ended up saving lives on the heels of the tragedy that they experienced. Now, let's talk about certain training modalities. And here's a quote from David Brooks. When the expert is using her practical knowledge, she isn't thinking more, she is thinking less. She has built up a repertoire of skills through habit and has thereby extended the number of tasks that she can perform without conscious awareness. We've heard this, training is to make training move from the conscious to the subconscious. My buddy Sam Hiddle, he's talks about how you can skip steps physically, but not mentally. We're with experience, we streamline a lot of our stuff. And so how do we do that? And quite simply, it's durability through exposure. And there's a couple different theories or coin terms out there. And I'll just talk about a couple of them. There's stress inoculation training. And I have another program where we talk about this, how to build those programs. But basically, we're just ratcheting up the stress over time. It's similar to crawl, walk, run. We start with the basics and simplicity in our training in the fire service. And over time, hey, let's ratchet up the speed. Let's ratchet up the aggressiveness. This is where maybe we start in just our duty clothes and we go through the skills. Then we put on our gear, reduce our mobility. Maybe we smoke out our SCBA face pieces to reduce our visibility. So now we're relying more on gross motor skills and the loss of vision. Then we also throw our packs on. We have the weight. We have that asymmetrical loading on our body. Maybe we do some things where we take our hearing away, where it sounds like we're in a fire building. The engines are humming. We're getting our heart rate up. We're running around. We're doing sledge swings. We're doing farmer's carries before we go into a drill, because that will replicate the fire closer than us just being in a climate-controlled environment where we can see and hear and feel everything. So we don't want to start in that run phase. We want to start in that crawl phase, but we have got to know what it feels like to get to that point, because that is more closely aligned with what the fireground is going to feel like. There's also this thing called cognitive control, and is just a strategy that directly confronts a stressor and all of its emotions. So you want to deal with the stressor head on. And the goal here is just to engage with that stressor in a productive way. So we want to see it, acknowledge it, do some problem solving for it. So let's find information. How are we going to create better understanding around this adverse event? And then let's create some solutions for it. And the goal here is to be more flexible, right? Flexible minds, especially on the fireground, are going to be more resilient to change. Because what happens is too often we rely on rigid habits, and just like Dennis Riley talks about, we just try to plan A harder. So let's try to pivot a little bit, not rely too much on rigid habits, which a lot of times we culminate through a lot of this crawl, walk, run training. And habits are good until they no longer serve us. So we need to be able to pivot. There's a theory called allostasis, and that's just creating stability through changing physiology to meet demands. So we see a stimulus or a stressor, we recognize it, we want to go through the motions of, all right, while I'm addressing it, I see it, let this not hijack my thought processes or let me get too stressed out. I'm going to ramp up my physical prowess to meet the demands of the scene. So another way to put this is, if you go on scene of a working fire and you have no response at all, well, that's probably not a healthy response. You should have a little bit of a cortisol dump. You should have some of those hormones that are going to help you regulate your systems. That's a normal process. You're going to rise up to meet those demands, and that's a good thing. And then there's also hormesis. Now a lot of people think of this with like vaccines. It's a low dose of a stressor that triggers a beneficial response and immunity. But if you take it out of like that vaccine world, we do the same thing with training, right? Let's institute these low doses of stress during our training, So that way we figure it out, we work through it, and then that becomes our new resting state. And then we introduce a low level of stress again, and we just basically keep one-upping our ability to manage the stress, but then also develop our skills. And one of two things typically happen in these situations, and I've seen it countless times, especially in all the survival training I do, is that there are some people that just don't manage that stress well. And oftentimes it's because they've never truly experienced it. They've taken a lot of easy routes. And there's this thing called avoidant coping. A person tries to escape or evade stressors. Now, there's a healthy balance to this. I'm not saying that you need to take on all stress all the time. Like if you are in an abusive relationship, you don't be like, all right, well, I need to figure out how to manage the stress, and you go back to the abuser. But we do need to have this other side, this healthy side called approach coping. And that's any strategy that directly confronts a stressor and its related emotions to deal with the stressor head on. And you engage in a productive way, and you problem solve, and you try to find more information. You want to have a better understanding, and then you find the solutions and support to overcome these situations. And that's what we need on the fireground and in these in extremis situations we find ourselves in. And throughout all this training, you can get some really high levels of skills and expertise. And I think it's really important, though, that we not make everything uber positive and have it work all the time. And what I mean by that is bad things are always going to happen. We're always going to get curveballs thrown to us while we're on the fireground. So at times, I think it is really important to have some negative visualizations. So we want to be placed in positions that do produce a little bit of anxiety, that throw us a curveball. And there's a lot of different ways around this. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum. More modern day take on that is a controlled failure protocol. But basically, this is a planned, deliberate introduction of failure into whatever your system is. So let's take, for example, an entanglement. We're going through entanglement props. We can't always just cleanly go through the entanglement prop. We need to feel what it feels like to get trapped, to really get cinched down. Maybe we can't radio our mayday because we can't reach up to our radio mic. How do we manage that? So little instances of negativity or anxiety producing events, I think, are good. They just have to be canned appropriately. So if you're an officer or somebody who manages training, make sure you cater it to the individual, in that one person has a deeper bucket for stress than another. And if we try to institute the same amount of stress for all the people, one person manages it better, another person, that could be a major setback. So we need to be in tune with where we are personally, but also if we're training shift members or other people, we need to be able to cater to that individual as well. Now, when we do all this training, what's some of the goals behind it on now more the cognitive side? Earlier, we talked about the prefrontal cortex and how that gets stressed out, what that does to us on the fireground. There's this other portion in the brain, in the frontal lobe near the prefrontal cortex, and it's called the AMCC, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, and that's also known as the willpower hub. So the MCC, from an evolutionary standpoint, it was kind of that thing that kept us from doing things that were too hard because of energy expenditure. If we go try to chase down that food, we burn up a ton of calories, and if we can't get it, then that might mean that we're more likely to die or be kicked out of the tribe, those kind of things that we talked about earlier. And so that piece of our brain is still wired within us, and it's centered around willpower and motivation, attention and prediction, your motor control, energy regulation, which I just talked about, and integration of other hemispheres in the brain and how they all work together. So if the AMCC doesn't get worked in an appropriate way, somebody who hasn't really leaned into a lot of risk, somebody who has a really comfortable life, this is where you see apathy and depression, low motivation, less tolerance to pain, more likely to experience pain, and also some OCD behaviors. And I think the idea there is that in a world that they don't have a deep bucket for stress, then they try to manage as many things as they can to kind of create the illusion of calm and organization. Now, with when you do hard things, whether it's through workouts, which is a common one, through hard training, even through meditation and breath work, you increase your willpower and motivation to do hard things. And that's massive here. You actually increase your capability to pay attention to certain events on the fireground, make meaning out of that ambiguous stimuli, and then predict what could happen or even go into decision making. So when you experience this, it is also, the AMCC also manages some of the hormonal response. So dopamine, noradrenaline, serotonin, and a lot of these drive motivation. So some people, when they experience an adverse event, they're like, whoop, nope, I'm out. And they kind of, roll on their back and give up. And that's not what we want. When you really drive into the AMCC, you actually improve markers for taking risk in a healthy way. And a lot of the key words that I've noticed in the research from NIH and other places when they talk about AMCC studies is you improve your tolerance to risk in a healthy way. You increase your tenacity. You increase your grit. You can do hard things longer. So the workouts, the training, if you find yourself in an adverse environment, and then there's less aversion to exterior demands. Like basically you can see things like, okay, well, that's worth addressing my energy on, this thing's not, and you can kind of decipher those things. And then some of the psychological, again, that we talked about is people who do hard things grow their AMCC. They actually notice that area in the brain, the gray matter, that region grows and becomes larger. So they're more intrinsically motivated. There's less apathy towards other people. There's less weight gain. You have increased response time. So again, that's huge for us when we need to make these really quick snap decisions. You actually decrease the time from seeing the stimulus and the stressor, creating a solution, and then acting on it. And then also your emotional response. People who have a larger, more in-depth AMCC have greater emotional control and have more appropriate emotional responses. So you see those people that maybe you work or live with that have the outbursts or their behaviors are wildly inconsistent. And sometimes that can be really hard to deal with. That could be a part of it. There's this other thing in research called the I's versus the T's, and this is breadth versus depth. And if you've been with me for a while in the Patreon community, we've talked about this in depth. And this is a pretty interesting quote from Andy Oderkirk. He's inventor at 3M, where he talks about the difference between the two. And so think of depth as being a specialist, right? You go deep down a rabbit hole, you know all the nuances of this one specific problem. And if you're working on well-defined and well-understood problems, then those specialists, the I's, the depth people work really, really well. The difference, though, is that as ambiguity and uncertainty increases, which is normal with systems problems, especially with what we experience on the fireground, breadth becomes more important. So that's the T, the top bar of the T, having a broader range of experience and skills. Now, the sweet spot for a specialist, so think maybe somebody who works in special operations, they want to glean fact and not necessarily opinion. And I got this from David Epstein, the author of Range. He says, the higher the domain of uncertainty, the more important it is to have a high breadth team member. So I think that's pretty important when we're on the fireground. We have those people that are just super, super highly skilled in maybe one area, but more often than not, my experience as an officer is I like what I call the utility fielders. In baseball, the utility fielder is they're so strong in just about any role on the baseball diamond that they can be dropped in any role. That's the idea behind a utility infielder. They can do a lot of things really, really well, and more often than not in problem areas and problem sets that are not well defined or maybe not well understood, or there's a lot of ambiguity, the people that have more breadth commonly do much better than the person that just has a ton of depth. Going back to what we talked about before, it's generally because they're super rigid in their habits. It's hard for them to zoom out and get more of a macro view. Sometimes they get so far outside of the box with decision making or their skills that we got to get them back inside the box. So think about your skills. Be a little introspective here. Are you an I or a T? Do you have breadth or is it depth? Breadth and depth is great. If you have to be one or the other, being that utility fielder generally was going to serve you better on the fireground. Now, here's some data that I got from the book Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. Highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books. And this is what we call effortless work. And here's just some studies, there's just some facts for mostly Americans, but just the modern day human compared to what it was years ago. Now, the CDC has found that humans today are fatter and less muscular than just 10 years ago. So just within a decade, we have gone down this slippery slope that's not good. There's some really neat studies that have found that prehistoric women were 16% stronger than today's Olympic rowers. So our current day Olympic athletes are not necessarily stronger than what the hunter-gatherers were back in the day. They're less strong. Hunter-gatherer communities, they're more active in 3/4 of one day than the common American is in 1 to 2 weeks. That's pretty crazy. And then just some physical fitness pursuits. I thought this was pretty interesting because I love the outdoors. I love hiking. I love trail running. When you do activities in the outdoors, especially rucking, hiking, trail running, you use 28% more energy per step in the outdoors than you do in indoor running, running on roads, running on treadmills. And we're going to this just comfortable work is what I'm trying to instill here, especially just on the fireground when we have so many musculoskeletal injuries. To get outside, work with uneven terrain, uneven planes and angles, it's good for our joints and our body. Heart disease, 25% of deaths. It's not necessarily fire service related. This is American stats. Cancer is 23%. Just accidents are 7%. Lung disease is 5%. So just by adding those up, 2/3 of our deaths in America are things that we can directly influence. So when you add all that up, it's about 60%. And when you work out, do rigorous workouts, and go above CDC recommendations of, I think it's 150 minutes of exercise per week, you are doing a lot of good and drastically reducing the chances of becoming sick or injured in one of those domains I just talked about. Now, workouts, I talk about this so often. We've really broken it down in real data on calls for the In Extremis Readiness podcast side of things. But some other domains that we can get into are BDNF. Regular exercise has been shown to boost levels of BDNF. And BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, along with some other neurotransmitters. And you just get this great hormonal dump during exercise, and it strengthens and repairs the plasticity of the brain, and it creates more neural pathways. So the benefit here is that you get better memory recall. You make sense of ambiguous information, and you can do it at a faster rate. You have better short and long-term memory, that memory recall, better spatial recognition and awareness, increased learning, better emotional regulation. And again, we talked about plasticity just in the brain, the hippocampus, and a bunch of regions in the brain. And when we talk about the AMCC and the prefrontal cortex, like all these things are influenced by that. So when we get in rigorous workouts, we're not just supporting our body's health, but also and cardiac health and lung health, but also our brain health and how that helps us aid in decision making and leaning into the fight on the fireground. So it's going to strengthen body and mind. It's going to motivate. You get better intrinsic motivation. And if for nothing else, it allows you to know your capabilities for yourself and what you can do on the fireground. It also helps you regulate your nervous system. So if you're somebody who's stressed or anxiety or depressed, research is abundantly clear about how it helps you blow off cortisol. It's an emotional reset. You are generally less depressed, less anxious. This is very well researched. It's going to allow for clearer thinking, and it's going to support better recovery. As William James says, the greatest thing in our education and our workouts is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. We can regulate responses, and it just means that you're going to have better overall resiliency for in life, but then also on the fireground. And then that kind of leads me into this last little bit. This is more of a psychological, behavioral thing, but even cultural. And I got this also from Michael Easer's book, but I've heard this from a lot of other thinkers out there. And this is Japanese culture of misogi. Some people pronounce it misogi, but it started way back when in Japanese culture, and a lot of it was a spiritual cleansing where they'd find cold water, waterfalls, rivers, and it was meant to be a spiritual cleansing. And over time, it kind of grew into this feat, for example, where they wanted to build more resilience. There's this self-discovery. There's a high chance of failure, and commonly you do it in nature. So some examples, one of the ones that I heard was a man had to swim underwater and carry a boulder, and he had to carry the boulder, I believe it was something like 1 mile. Maybe it was a 5K, I don't exactly remember, but he had to dive down, grab the rock, carry it underwater as far as he could. When he needed a breath, he would drop the rock, come back up, take a breath, dive back down, do it all over again until he covered a mile. And this is something that needs to have a potential for a high failure rate, because if it's too easy, you're not growing that resilience. You're not embracing discomfort. The goal here is to kind of conquer these self-limiting beliefs, really grow yourself. And a common recommendation for misogi is to do it once per year. I've gone on some pretty big hikes that were a little dicey, and it made me really uncomfortable, whether it was the altitude or the climbing or being in the wilderness without good connections. Being in nature, also, there's just a massive amount of research on what nature does to you on a psychological but also physiological level for health and benefit. So the only thing I'm trying to do here is have a little bit of a call to action, because I do believe that a lot of people really don't understand what they're capable of. And by embracing a little bit of discomfort and choosing to do something hard, you actually grow that cultural side of you, that behavioral side of you that says, hey, I actually am much more capable of more than what I thought I was. And now you have a higher bar for motivation, for resilience, for discomfort. And again, I hope I'm making all these things that make sense, because they all play off of each other, and all these systems support each other, from the psychological to the behavioral to the physiological, all the things happening in the brain and the body. These are just things that just can't be understated. And like I say before, we are these whole human beings. We're not just somebody who can work out, and do hard workouts. We're also somebody who needs to have high expertise in our training and skills. And these things need to meet up, because on the fireground, all those incompetencies, are going to be exposed. Now, kind of wrapping this up, going back to David Brooks here, the mentors who really lodge in the mind are the ones who are hard on us, or at least were hard on themselves and set the right example, not the ones that were easy on us. They were the ones who balanced unstinting love with high standards and relentless demands on behalf of something that they took seriously. We think we want ease and comfort, and of course we do from time to time, but there is something inside us that longs for some calling that requires dedication and sacrifice. And if that's not a good analogy for the fire service, I don't know what is. And this is from Colonel Thomas Colden's on personal responsibility. And these are attributes of leaders who can be trusted in combat. In his book, he talks about professions where there's a possibility of death or serious injury. And they talked about leadership principles and characteristics that highly successful teams built and curated over time for these professions where you could die, which is the fire service, right? And for attributes of leaders who can be trusted in combat, it was loyalty, having honest and good integrity. They lead by example. They have self-control and stress management. We talked about consistent behaviors earlier. They're confident, but not arrogant. They're courageous, both physically and morally. They share information, so there's psychological safety with the team. There's personal connections with their subordinates, and there's a strong sense of duty. And one of the most important things that they found from the team believing that their leader can get them out of a bad situation was leader competence. So going back to your physical prowess, your technical expertise, your tactical acumen that we've talked about. All those things matter. And if you're in a position of leadership, especially, this is not, yes, absolutely, the recruit firefighter all the way up through senior firefighters and leaders need to have this, but we need to develop competence in our skills over time. And K. Anders Ericsson, in The Making of an Expert, says, the journey to truly superior performance is neither for the faint of heart nor the impatient. The development of genuine expertise requires struggle, sacrifice, and honest, often painful self-assessment. There are no shortcuts. It will take you at least a decade to achieve expertise, and you will need to invest that time wisely by engaging in deliberate practice. Practice that focuses on tasks beyond your current level of competence and comfort. I think that's a good way to wrap this up. It's basically how we started this episode, talking about how this isn't just going to happen overnight. This is something that needs to be curated both personally and professionally over time. And, we're just coming into the new year, right? And everybody talks about the new year, new me, working on resolutions, and that's fine. That's personally not my thing. If I acknowledge that something needs to be changed, I'm like, well, okay, well, if it's worth changing, it's worth changing right now. And then also on day one, hopefully I've developed the skills and the habit and the discipline to just keep doing what I've been doing that serves me and my family and my team well. So I hope that for everybody. I want that for you. But then if you are in this introspective period where hey, we need to up the ante a little bit, just realize that the good things in life come with struggle. They come with sacrifice, and they come with that honest, often painful self-assessment. And this is not going to be something that happens overnight. And going back to kind of wrapping up this entire thing with safety and risk aversion and developing grit, Helen Keller, of all people, said that security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. So thank you, everybody. If you are interested, the Key City Fire Conference is coming up in Frederick, Maryland in March 2026. It's already opened up the application process. I'm going to be doing a deeper dive on this with, pictures and video and all kinds of more in-depth stuff with this. So, and never mind my bit, there's hands-on training. There's a lot of incredible lecture from incredible speakers and keynotes, hands-on on the weekend, events at night. If this is something you're interested in, please check it out at keycityfireconference.org. And come spend a day with some awesome instructors. But I appreciate everybody. Welcome any questions or comments, and please like, share, subscribe. Thanks for hanging out with me. Hope you got something out of it. Get after it.